Hey guys, this is Smithy. Welcome to my channel. If you guys are new here, welcome. Today we're going to talk about the newest Anastasia palette, and this is the ABH Nouveau palette. Nouveau palette? Nouveau palette? I don't know how do you pronounce it. I'll put it on the screen for you guys so that you can see it for yourself. We are going to dupe this palette. This palette has 12 shades. It has a mix of mattes, shimmers and a duochrome. And this palette retails at $55, which is a little more pricey than the normal ABH palettes because generally ABH palettes are around like I would say $40 to $45. And also generally Anastasia palettes are like, it comes with 14 shades, but this palette only comes with 12 shades. I prefer this palette sizing just because I do not go through the shades in a palette. I just don't go through it. So I don't need like bigger pan sizes for more costly prices. I'm not up for that. I would rather get like more shades instead of more product in it. That's just me. Let's move on to the palette details. The palette launches on June 13th, which I think it's a Monday. And this palette is more of like a neutral, cool color story. I would think when I saw this palette, it totally reminded me what I thought about the Natasha Denona retro palette is going to be. Because when the Natasha Denona mini retro came into perspective, it was more of like a peachy, mossy green color story. And that's what this palette is all about, with like one lavender thrown in there. So I was like thinking of this color story when I thought of Natasha Denona's retro. But this is ABH, and we know I love ABH's quality. I have several of their palette. I have ABH Jackie Aina palette, I have Modern Renaissance palette, I have Subculture palette, I have Sultry palette. I have a ton from ABH, so I know that I love the quality of the palette, but I would say this color story won't be for me. And I'll explain it to you when we go through the swatches, when we go through the eye looks. I have all these shades already in my collection, so I won't be picking it up, but let me know in the comment section below, are you interested about this palette or not? So I basically duped this palette with the swatches that I saw on Anastasia's story, and I'll give you like a side by side of my swatches versus Anastasia Beverly Hills Instagram swatches so that you can see it for yourself whether it does match to your liking or not. But yes, without further ado, let's dive right into the swatches. The first shade in the palette is called Wings, and this is definitely a unique shade from that palette that I couldn't find in the palettes that I was talking about. But this I duped from the shade called Right Hand Mando, and this is from the Mandalorian palette from Colourpop. This is the only shade that is from this palette. And this is basically defined as like a cool tone green shimmer shade with silver particles in it. It looks mainly like a silver shade, but it definitely has that green undertone. I would also say, if you're not very particular with the undertone, the shade which is called Fire Butts from Tiny Marvel's palette would be a lot similar, but instead of that silver reflex, this has a little bit of gold reflex. So I would say this would be, let me swatch both these shades for you guys so that you can see the difference. So this is the one that I swatched right now, the Right Hand Mando shade, and this is Fire Butts from the Tiny Marvels palette. Now you can see the undertone difference. This is definitely warm toned and this is more of a cool toned shade. And in that ABH palette, I would say it's a little more on the cool tone side. That's why I chose this shade. But yes, if you do not want like that shade and you lean towards more of a warmer tone, I would say Fire Butts is a very, very close shade. Okay, now let's move on. Next shade in the palette is called Isle, which has been duped by mixing actually two shades from the Sultry palette, and I would mix the shade Pearl and Rose Quartz together. It's more close to Rose Quartz, I would say, but it's definitely not that dark. I would say it's a mid shade between these two. Also, if you do have, let's say, the Corderosa palette from Sigma, I would say a very close shade would be this shade, which is called Belle of the Ball. So let me swatch it for you guys. I think Anastasia did take that Sultry palette off just because she was getting this palette. And I knew that some kind of a neutral cool tone palette is going to come in the market, especially in Anastasia's line, because it definitely did not make sense to get rid of this palette. So this is how that shade looks, which dupes the shade Isle from the palette. And you can see it's little bit more of like a champagne rose gold shade. Beautiful for inner corners or lid shade if you are going more on that peachy route. Let me take off my watch. Let's move on to the next shade, and the next shade is called Belle. And this is again duped by the shade from the Sultry palette. And the shade that dupes that shade is called Cinder. And this is basically defined as a metallic antique bronze shade. So this is the shade Cinder from the palette, which dupes the shade Belle from the Anastasia palette. It's again an antique bronze shade. I would say it fits well with a cool tone, neutral tone palette. So as far as like the shades are concerned, we have handled like 3 shimmers so far. So now let's move on to the first matte of the palette, and that is called Wisteria, and that is basically like a matte lavender shade, which is being duped by this shade, which is called Jewel Bee from the Tiny Marbles palette. And again, this is defined as a matte pastel lavender. So let me swatch it for you guys. And of course, like if you have Tiny Marbles palette, you know the formula. It's absolutely amazing. Like Sydney Gray's formula is like top-notch quality. And that is the shade Jewel Bee, which dupes the shade Wisteria from the ABH palette. Now the next shade in the palette is called Lily, which is being duped by the shade which is called Meadowhawk from the Tiny Marbles palette. And this is defined as a metallic rose gold with multi-dimensional reflex to it. I would say, to be exact, I would say it would be like close dupe, like a between shade from Meadowhawk and Marvels together, but I think it's closer to this. So I'm gonna swatch that shade. And I've used the dupes of this palette to create both of the eye looks that you're seeing on my eyes. So if you're interested to see how I achieve these looks, it would be towards the end of the video. So this is the shade Meadowhawk, which dupes the shade Lily from the ABH palette. But I would say if you mix the shade Marvel to it, it would lighten the tone a little bit, and I would say it will be a little more closer to that shade. Okay, now let's move on to the next shade. The next shade in the palette is called Hope, and this is being duped by the shade Ember from the Sultry palette. And this is defined as a metallic olive green with gold reflex to it. I absolutely love that shade. I mean, I love like greeny, bronzy shades, especially for like, you know, for all eye tones, I would say, but especially for brown eyes, it pops like so badly. It's really good. And that's the shade Ember that dupes the shade Hope from the ABH palette. And you can see it's like more, it's not like green in your face. It's more like a greeny bronze, like an antique bronze shade. Beautiful. Okay, now let's move on to the next shade, and the next shade is called Paloma, and this is basically like a skin tone shade. I mean, you don't need any specific shade. If you have like your skin tone face powder, it'll do the job, but I'm going to just dupe it with this shade, which is called Fresh from the palette, but anything would do. I think it has a little more of a peach tone. So if you have the Corderosa palette, the shade Veranda would be very close to it. So yeah, any skin tone shade, I would say. So let me swatch that. And that dupes the shade Paloma from the ABH palette. Okay, now let's move on to the next shade. The next shade is called Fleur. I would say if you do have the Chocolate Martini palette from Glamlight, 2 of the mattes are from this palette. Actually, 2 mattes and 1 shimmer is from this palette. So I would say it's very, very close to this shade, which is called Irish Cream. So let's swatch that. But if you do not have this palette, I would say if you have the Corderosa palette, the shade which is Corderosa, this shade at the extreme end is very, very close to that. So let's swatch this. It's basically like my skin tone shade, but a little more on like a peachy pinky side. And that's the shade Irish Cream that dupes the shade Fleur from the palette. It's a great blending or like a crease transitioning shade in your palette. Now let's move on to the next shade. The next shade is called Liberty, and this is basically like that dirty mossy green shade, and this is the deepest matte shade in the palette, which I have some concerns about. And this is being duped by the shade called Walking Stick from the Tiny Marbles palette, and I would say this is like an exact dupe to it. So creamy. So let's watch that. So that is the shade Walking Stick from the Tiny Marbles palette. that dupes the shade called Liberty from the ABH palette. Now let's move on to the first duochrome shade in the palette, and this is called Peacock. And this is basically like that blue-brown pigment that MAC had, that Wet n Wild had, that Tiny Marvels has. So this is being duped by the shade called Scarab from the Tiny Marvels palette. So, such a beautiful shade. I personally feel like if you like duochromes, you definitely do have this kind of a shade somewhere in your collection for sure. Because this is how the duochrome started. And again, this is the shade called Scarab from the Tiny Marvels palette that dupes the shade called Peacock from the palette. Now let's move on to the next shade, and the next shade is called Metro. And I feel like I'm duping the shade by duping it with the shade called Syrup from the palette. But I feel like in the pan, it looks more closer to the shade called Bloom from the Sultry palette. It's not electric as Bloom is, because Bloom is a little more on the pinkier side. The shade Metro is a little more on the muted side, and that's why I'm gonna dupe it with this shade, which is Syrup from the Glam Light Chocolate Martini palette. And that is the shade that dupes the shade Metro from the palette. I would say if you like mix a little bit of Bloom, that would give a good shade match. Let's see. I would say Bloom is also super close. Yeah, I would say yeah. So that's how it is. I basically mix the shade Syrup and Bloom together to get that shade. Yeah, but a very, very nice shade for like the palette, I would say. So that dupes the shade Metro from the ABH palette. And the last shade in the palette is called Muse, and this is basically the deepest shade in the palette, but it is in the shimmer form. And this is being duped by the shade called Chocolate Liquor from the Glam Light Chocolate Martini palette. And this again is like a deep chocolatey dark chocolate shade with a ton of like shimmer to it. And that is the shade Chocolate Liquor that dupes the shade Muse from the ABH palette. So that is the entire palette swatched out for you guys. It's a beautiful color story, but I would say I would have loved if we would have, I don't know, maybe eliminated the second shade, and instead of that we would have gotten more of like a deeper matte shade in the palette. But yeah, nevertheless, this is how the palette swatched, and this is how I duped the palette. Let me know in the comment section below, how do you like the dupes? I'll give you a close-up of all these swatches in the outside lighting too, so that you can see all the dimensions, all the shades in like natural lighting. But yes, now let's move on to the two looks that I created using this dupe shades. Okay, let me first set my eyes with this shade Fresh on both the eyelids actually. So let's take that. And this is basically like blending any concealer or foundation that's gone on my eyelid, and just to provide like a smooth base so that everything flows on top very nicely. And this is, as you can see, like when it blends, it just blends into my skin. So any pressed powder foundation would do. Now let's do like two-toned eyes. For that, I'm going to first start off with this shade, which is called Irish Cream, and I'm going to take that on my crease. It's a beautiful, like a transitioning shade. I'm going to take the same shade on my lower lash line too. Now once we have like that transitioning shade all built up, now I'm going to take this shade, which is Syrup. I'm going to just do the same thing, just a little more lower than the shade Irish Cream. I'm going to take the same shade on my lower lash line too. Now to deepen up the outer corner, I'm going to dip into this shade, which is Walking Stick. And let's do that. I'm also going to build that shade on my outer corners of my lower lash line, just so that everything is like smooth transitioning. I'm going to take this shade, which is Scarab from the palette, and I'm going to take that majorly towards like the center of my eyelid. Such a pretty shade. Now for the inner third, I'm going to dip into like mixing this shade, Pearl and Rose Quartz together. And let's just put something on our inner third. I'm just going back to that Scarab shade and just blending both of it together, because I definitely don't want to like lose that shade. And that Rose Quartz and Pearl can become like a scooping moment in the inner third. First, let me finish off this eye with some liner and mascara, and I'll get right back. And that's my first eye look. Now let's move on to the second eye look. So for that, I'm going to first take the shade Flutterby, this lavender purple shade, and let's try to include that in the other eye look. So I'm going to take that more towards the crease. So the one thing that I'm noticing is basically for the darkest shade, there's only one shade in the palette, and that's that matte hunter green shade, which we duped with the shade Walking Stick. So yeah, that would be a challenge. Anyways, let's take that, the same Walking Stick shade, for our outer corners. I'm going to take the same shade on my lower lash line too. Okay, once we have some kind of a depth here, I'm going to take this shade, which is Meadowhawk from the palette, and I'm going to take that mainly right here, like towards the inner third to the center of my eyelid. Now just to blend this shade towards that deeper matte shade, I'm going to take this shade, which is Cinder from the palette, from the Sultry palette, basically from the center, like melting from that peachy rose goldy shade towards that deeper green matte shade. And it's more of like a green brown shade, so this can be like a easy mid-tone shade that blends with it. I'm going to take that same shade on my lower lash line. And then for my inner corners, I'm going to dip into this shade and this shade mixed together. I'm going to put that on my inner corners. Okay, now let me finish off this eyes with some liner and mascara, and I'll get right back. And this is my second eye look. I really hope that you guys enjoyed both the eye looks. The one thing that I really noticed is there is no such like deepening up shade. The only one deepening shade that I could like use for both the eyes is that it's called Liberty from the palette, which I basically duped with the Walking Stick shade. But I don't think that is like deep enough to deepen up all the eye looks that you can create with that palette. I think the deepest shade that you can find in that palette is a shimmer shade, which is like a chocolatey shimmer shade. Until unless that is like a satin shade that can blend to a matte, I think I'm missing like a deep dark, like maybe a black or maybe like a spider shade from this palette. But yes, that's what I think, that basically what I'm like missing from that palette. Maybe instead of putting that Isle shade and Lily shade, they could have swapped one with like a deeper matte shade. I think that would complement the palette really well. But yes, I really hope that you guys enjoyed both these eye looks. Let me know in the comment section below, are you picking up this palette or skipping like me? Because I feel like all these shades I already have in my collection, so I don't want to get like duplicates of these shades, especially when this year I'm specifically looking for like unique shades in the palette. This won't be like unique to my collection, so I would be skipping this for sure. If you did like this video, if you do like dupe videos, I have a complete playlist of dupe that I would link that in the by the end of the video, so stay tuned for that. I will link it and you can find a lot of dupes on this channel, because I love doing that. I won't say dupe, but I would say similar, finding like similar shades from my collection. I really hope that would be helpful for you guys, and if you did like this video, do give it a thumbs up and also subscribe to my channel if you haven't already, and ring that notification bell so that you're notified every time that I post next. I generally upload 3 videos every single week, every Tuesdays, Thursdays and Saturdays at 9 AM Eastern Standard Time. Until next time, I'll see you guys in my next video. Bye guys!